countries and markets. Feel free to add where you're joining us from, as is in the chat. And if you have any questions during the session, please feel free to drop them in the comment section. We'll try to get to them during or shortly after the live. Our topic for today's live discussion is very exciting. It's beyond localization, how culturalization shapes global game success. So to introduce it, I would say that games are worlds. They are not only text on screen, unlike some digital products. They include characters, stories, humor, gestures, references, and a lot of subtle details. So when a game crosses borders, all of those elements come together to shape how players understand and go through the whole experience. And today we'll be talking about how localization and culturalization work together to help studios solve the puzzle of going international and build stronger global player experience. I'm very excited to be joined by the two speakers who bring different but very complementary perspectives. First, we have Kate Edwards. Kate is CEO of Geographer. Kate is geographer, culturalization strategist, and she's one of the leading voices in game culturalization. Kate brings to us decades of experience helping games adapt to the cultural and geopolitical complexity. Hi, Kate. We're very glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Would you like also to maybe expand a little bit on your background and how it informs, especially with the background in geography and cartography, how it helps inform your journey in the culturalization industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, back when I started, which was I started in the game industry in 1993 when I was at Microsoft. I was there from 92 to 05. And my very first game was Flight Sim 5.0 in 1993. I was assisting them with some cartographic advice for the UI. And then it just evolved where I started getting questions from all over the company. And as the games division at Microsoft started to grow and expand, including with the Xbox, my skill set was really useful to them in helping them with cultural representation, historical accuracy, geopolitical sensitivity, like setting a game in the real world, or even fantasy worlds that use allegories of real world cultures or real world situations. And so I found that I basically could speak their language. I'm a huge nerd. That also helps. You could probably tell from my background. I consume a lot of sci-fi and fantasy media, which a lot of games focus on. So I think that there was a confluence of all the things that I am interested in that came together very strongly working in games, including my interest in, creative media and in cutting edge technology. So at this point, after 33 years, I've worked on 321 games as of last week. And a lot of games tends to be mostly what we call AAA games. But I've worked on all kinds of indie and even board games and card games. And the only other thing I'll say is I also spent 5 years running the International Game Developers Association, and also spent 3 years running the Global Game Jam, which is the world's largest game creation event that happens every January.
Thank you so much, Kate. This is such a multifaceted experience, and it's also fascinating to me when I read a little bit about your journey, how you pioneered the whole cultural intelligence in Microsoft. So I think the work that you did set the beginning to the complex challenge of adapting to the geopolitical and cultural challenges. I think it would be safe to say that even the Microsoft today wouldn't be the way it is without this contribution.
Thanks.
All right, we also have Nadzeya Drahun from Alconost. Nadzeya's role has combined localization project management with customer success. So she brings a very practical behind the scenes look on how localization vendors and game localization works with context, workflows, quality, LK and LKT, and the many more details of game localization. Nadia, could you share a little bit more about your background at Alconost and how your cross-functional experience helps you drive the game localization projects?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Yeah, I worked as a localization project manager at Alconost with a different pool, different kinds of clients, different kinds of content, but probably localization of games is my most favorite type of content because of its complexity and some challenges which you can come across while doing localization of games. And it will become obvious in the course of this conversation. Then I switched to the position of a customer success manager, where I use all my expertise in order to make sure that our clients are happy and their experience with Alconost is a success story. And today, I will be, as mentioned earlier, we'll be talking about the practical side of localization and how localization actually saves and facilitates the user experience.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I think thank you both of you. We will. I think this combination of experiences will contribute to really deep conversation. And I would like to start with the section that will focus more on the title of our session, beyond localization. So localization is one of the key things that may come to mind when game teams think about expanding globally. But as we mentioned, with games beyond language, there are so many more details like the world, the story, the design, and I think it would be useful to start by defining the terms culturalization and localization. So, Kate, you've often described culturalization as something that goes way beyond language, and to our viewers who may be new to the term and to the complexity of different processes in going international, how would you describe this difference between localization and culturalization?
Well, from my perspective, I mean, one of the things I think that, and I know some of my colleagues in the localization field disagree with me when I say that I've asserted before that localization is a subset of culturalization. And a lot of my colleagues who do translation think it's the opposite. But the reason, when I left Microsoft, nobody was using the term culturalization. And I started asserting that as a differentiator between localization, which I think for the great majority of people working in tech and in games, localization means language translation. That's typically what it involves on any project. And so my viewpoint is that culturalization is the broader aspect of what we're doing on any content, is basically trying to make sure it's culturally adapted to that locale. And language is a very important part of culture, but it's not the only part of culture. And that's why I kind of see localization as a key subset of culturalization, because what I tend to focus on with culturalization is almost everything that's not translation. So when we're thinking about like gestures and body language or symbology or history or religion or allegory, or could be any number of things, character design, the use of costumes, cultural appropriation. I mean, all of these kinds of issues typically fall outside what a language translator typically does. Now, that's not to say that language translator, they certainly bring their own cultural viewpoint and experience to the project, but at least in my experience working on many games, that's not what they get paid to do. They get paid to translate. So, sometimes on some projects they might get paid to do extra, but usually they focus on their job, which is just doing the language translation. And then what I focus on is pretty much all the other aspects of the content that can also be potentially either problematic or potential opportunity to modify the content to make it more compatible with the local market.
Yeah, I think it's really useful to separate those two and define the cultural review and the cultural adaptation as a separate category. What actually surprised me when I dived into the term culturalization is that from my earlier years in the industry, I often encountered three terms: localization, globalization, and internationalization.
Yeah.
However, culturalization culturalization was not always the part of the discussion, and I think it's very important to introduce it as part of this collection. It's really interesting that you mentioned that translators definitely bring their innate understanding of culture, but their key job is to translate the content itself. So I would ask Nadia, from your experience, how often does localization feedback beyond translation reveal some deeper cultural or content issues in the source game? Have you seen cases where a translator flagged something that is beyond word for word or localized translation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. We're not just translating words. So we are we are working to keep the game tone, clarity, UI readability, and most of all, we are helping the game to keep its players motivated to play even more. That's why a proper localization process always reveals things so that they're not purely linguistic. And for example, I had like a client, they did on a regular basis live ops, and these live ops were dedicated to global events like Brazilian Carnival or Halloween, and they had this whole universe with the different creatures, and for each event they created a creature with some special character name, and we had to localize that character name which should reflect this event. And sometimes the problem is that like this whole concept like maybe not existent in their target audience, and translators need to use some wordplay in order to transfer this meaning and to make sure that these live ops become successful and have a good conversion. So yeah, for sure, this is like a good example. Or probably another example is when in games they use songs in order to transfer some characters' mood, and we also need to understand if we just use that song as is or we localize it and just find some good equivalent in order also to have this feeling of the game, not to just break it. So yeah, definitely.
So does this deeper cultural adaptation usually come as an initiative of translators, or is it more like the direct request of clients?
Well, I'd say it's both, and also this is actually where a localization vendor can add value, because normally a localization PM is responsible for collecting all the assets like glossary, style guides, description of creatures. Also, PM can request a screencaster from directors to screenwriters in order for the team to better understand the content, because of course PMs notice when there are a lot of issues raised by translators for some elements of the UI, it's obvious it's not just about the UI, that probably something is going on with the source string itself, and something should be checked and clarified. So yeah, it's both the linguist input and also the developers' initiative, like to share all this context information with the team.
Thank you. I think it would also be interesting to what you mentioned. I think it can also relate to Kate's area of culturalization, or like our cultural review happens more like closer to the production, while I think I saw Kate defining culturalization as an important step in the earlier timing of the process. Of course, both localization and culturalization are always much easier to deal with when they are not treated as some last-minute lunch tasks, but it seems to me that they still enter the process in a little bit different ways. Kate, this kind of cultural review and culturalization, from your experience, how early should it enter the creative and publishing process?
Well, it really needs to start at the very beginning. I mean, at the very first concept stage, we have concept art and an early version of the script and all these things. And that is one key distinction, I would say, between culturalization and localization, is even though I argue that, and I often tell my clients, the localization folks also need to be in the room on day one, because they need to know, they need to have an idea of what kind of text, how much text, what kind of issues are going to be in the game that they will have to face once they get to the localization phase. But oftentimes, sadly, localization, just like QA and some other things, are kind of treated, well, we wait and do that later. But honestly, those people need to be in the room also at the beginning. But with my work on culturalization, as I've told many teams over the years, I can be far more effective if I'm in the room right away at the beginning, because we can look at what is the world that you're building, who's in it, what happens there, are there factions, are there religions, are there politics, are there economics. So basically, I often see myself as a world building partner to kind of look over their shoulder and kind of give them a sense that, hey, this idea is great, but it may not work in this region, or it may not work in this market, and here's why. And then, I provide them with advice, and it's up to them whether or not they want to change it, because obviously it's their creative vision. It's like, we're not there to dictate to them the right and wrong of it. We're there to provide them with options and say, hey, well, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. So we kind of show them the options available to them in terms of the creative vision. And, typically most of the issues that I deal with, it's not like the whole idea of the game is bad. It's usually something very surgical, like, using one particular culture for inspiration, or using this one symbol or something like that. So it tends to be much more surgical in nature. So it's not like I'm there to like cancel the idea, which I don't even have the power to do, although I kind of did when I was at Microsoft. But and that only happened once. In all the games I worked on at Microsoft, we actually had one game canceled just because of the representation of Native Americans and Native American culture in the game was just, it was so bad. And it basically, there was no way to fix it. So anyway, so yeah, basically early is better. And then after, because obviously it's a lot easier and it's cheaper to make those changes early. And then as we get into production, then typically that's when they start sending like batches of content to basically review the actual assets as they're being created, to make sure they're kind of still on track with the goals that they have for the overall, vision of the game.
So what you're saying is that it is important to involve early, but also it's very important to have culturalization checkpoints, right, throughout
Yes.
The process. And to circle back to what you said about localization folks being in the room, it's a very interesting perspective. To expand on this a little bit, what would you say on which levels who should be in the room for all the culturalization conversations beyond localization team? So what it happens on so many levels, the designing of the game. So what teams are typically involved in the culturalization conversations?
Well, typically, I mean, it's primarily the people providing the culturalization expertise. So usually it's me, for example, if I'm helping a team, but obviously having localization in the room as well, because there is certainly, I mean, I work very closely with localization, as you can imagine, and I've had many cases where localization vendors come to me to provide the culturalization part for a game that they're working on while they focus on the localization aspect. So I've worked at this point with a lot of localization vendors across the industry over the years. But I would also say you need to have marketing and PR. You should have legal, definitely have legal in the room. You also should have the main producers of the game, as well as the creative leads, especially the creative art and audio leads should also be present.
Thank you. It seems like a very multi-layered process. It also gave birth to another question. What are, since it's so important to have culturalization early in the process, what would you say are the most high stakes decisions that are easier to adjust early but become so expensive later on? What is the most hardest to fix if the culturalization and localization folks aren't involved early?
Well, I mean, I would say that's the challenge, is that if you don't, I mean, typically a localization issue, which we're saying if that's primarily a text-based issue, in my experience, that tends to be a bit easier to fix depending on where the text actually appears. I mean, if it's a UI element, obviously that's more difficult. But if it's, you know, like subtitles or it's some other text that's in the game, if it's not like in a hard-coded asset, like it's a virtual book that you open in like an RPG or something, typically it's a bit easier to fix. Whereas if you're talking about a character design or a piece of architecture or something that is more fundamental to like a game level or to the gameplay, especially if we're talking about anything that's on the principal characters and not like on an NPC, then you're talking about really expensive changes and very complicated changes. So the stakes are very high. I mean, and this has happened. This has happened on many games I've worked on. Probably one of the most grievous examples, which I won't go into right now, involved one audio file. It was just one audio file that undermined not only the entire game, but caused a huge PR issue for the company. So it could be any number of things.
I think we're. It also can touch on into the this distinction between reactive and proactive culturalization, right? So reactive culturalization can cost so much more than proactive culturalization. Would you say that it is more about managing the PR crisis, or it's more about like fundamentally? Could you like draw the distinction between how proactive and reactive culturalization may look like to viewers?
Well, yeah, the way that I define those two things is reactive culturalization essentially is the act of looking for things that cause offense and looking for things that people will react to in a negative way. And so that is a proactive process. It's something that we do from the very start of the game development. But it's basically, that's the focus, though. We're looking for things that are going to cause that kind of reaction in a way that's not going to be good for the game or the team. It's going to, you know, impact revenue and other things. Whereas proactive culturalization is more about the act of designing the game for a specific culture or for a specific demographic. And there's examples of this where I've worked on, like the mobile game Temple Run 2. We actually did a special skin for Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead holiday, only for the Mexico market, where we basically changed the UI elements and changed the character design and some of the environmental elements to reflect the Day of the Dead holiday. And that was mainly to make make something special for the players just in Mexico, even though, of course, the holidays is celebrated by Hispanic communities, you know, all outside of Mexico as well, like in the United States. But that version was released in Mexico, and the sales saw a huge spike through the ceiling because people responded very positively to that. They felt that there was like, you're actually speaking to us, you're actually recognizing who we are. And that technique was so successful that we did it again for the Holi holiday, the Festival of Colors in India.
That is absolutely amazing. It also I would like also to bring in Nadia here. Similarly, do you see the similar pattern in localization industries? As in, there are some proactive strategies, while I guess I would imagine reactive localization would mean dealing with some urgent fixes, LQT, LKA. As a vendor, how do you think, how often do you think we deal with reactive versus proactive localization?
Well, definitely, this is also about like these initial steps of preparing games for localization. It also starts in the very beginning, and like such rules as no hard-coded strings, clear string IDs, and you know, all these things, gender where applicable, plural forms, they should be regarded, because if not, we had like really like a great case when we had like for a game just a separate great style guide for syntax, because the client created it so hard that for translators it was impossible to focus on the translation itself. They had to just bear in mind where they need to put their translation because of so many variables, which just broke their experience of translating. I'm not even saying about the experience that followed with the gamers. And as a result, we had to perform LQT in order to understand what's going wrong, because it was it had this game included a lot of creatures with a lot of dialogue speaking one to another, and because of this experience it was impossible to translate and follow all these dialogues, but the main focus was on the variables and following the syntaxes. So and and it was really an interesting case. As a result of LQT, it was discovered that were two creatures, one an old one, another a child creature talking to each other, and because of this break in the experience, we had an old creature sounded like vice versa, like a child. So really it was a very sad, but fortunately we fixed it quite in the time before its global launch. So so definitely there are a lot of kind of issues. Some of them should be fixed reactively, and of course especially concerns mobile games when you have live ops and you need to react. You need to because otherwise all the conversion rates again just will drop, and that's not a good thing for the whole localization team. So definitely different approaches, or another good example, for example, when for creatures clientele that we prefer gender neutral creatures, but okay, for English it may be good, but if we take Spanish, German, French, where we can just it's impossible really. And we in this situation when we need to just decide what to do next with all these gender forms, because now we already have a code. So really this is all these features, all these things are really important for localization.
That is a really interesting topic about character gender localization, specifically in the context when we have so how do we deal with this when there is undefined gender in the source language in English, or non-gender, or it's not either male or female? How do we deal with transitioning into the languages where there are polar genders? Here?
In most cases, we still need to agree on some definite form, because it will be just impossible. But of course, where possible, we try to use passive forms there, and any noun construction in order to avoid some verb forms, if it's possible. If not, then we just need we have to do, just decide on their gender, and that's it.
All right. So Nadia, you also mentioned how translate the whole. I think the whole process of translation behind the scenes can be a bit messier if it's not prepared for beforehand. So what would be your advice to game teams? What should they prepare before they start translation? For example, should they care about internationalization, about string files, prepare context? So what would be the best to-do list before they go to the localization vendor in order for the process to be as smooth as possible?
Mm-hmm. Well, all these earlier, which we mentioned earlier, these technical aspects are definitely a must, because you need to make sure, otherwise you would have to deal with a lot of LQT afterward. But also what's important here is a style guide, preparing a style guide, and for games, preparing description of creatures where you understand the mechanics of the game. Sometimes we were even requested to our clients to provide different screencasts, because without it, it was also very hard to understand what's going on in the game, what's the whole vibe of the game. So really it's all possible context information which the client can provide, including all these mentioned above.
Thank you. I think this transitions smoothly into another topic I hoped we would cover is the importance of context, but maybe it works differently for localization and culturalization. But I think it's one of the strongest intersections between those functions. So for localization, a word without context can be so easily mistranslated, and for culturalization, I'm guessing maybe a simple symbol without context can also be misread. A character can become a stereotype, a map, gesture, joke can mean a very different things depending on the market. And so, Kate, in your area of culturalization, how do you work with context? How do you evaluate it around something like map, gesture, symbol, reference, historic element?
Well, yeah, context, of course, with any content. I mean, language, cultural cues, anything is absolutely fundamental. I mean, we cannot do this work without context. I mean, any kind of cultural adaptation, whether it's visual or linguistic or anything. So it's like we need to know from the game teams. We cannot rely on the old techniques, especially like in localization with a spreadsheet with just lines. Just translate this. It's like, yeah, who's speaking? Where are they? What time of day? What's the whole? Who are they speaking to? I mean, all of those kinds of questions. And it's no different for culturalization where we're dealing with non-linguistic assets. I mean, like they're saying, well, we have a character that makes these gestures. It's like, when? Why? What's the meaning? What's the intent behind the gesture that they're making? So I need to know these things very clearly. And so oftentimes with the culturalization work, I almost demand that I have to know the context of the environment. I have to know exactly where is this thing going to be placed and why. I mean, a great example of this was all the work that I did on Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which was, that was replicating real world environments, the Vatican, the Giza Plateau in Egypt, the Sukhothai ruins in Thailand, and a few other locations. And part of the team's goal was cultural and historical accuracy and authenticity. And so with that in mind, I mean, we had to spend an enormous amount of time making sure that we understood exactly what the context is. So like for some of it, it's easy, like the Giza Plateau, which they basically recreated in the game, is a real place. It has very real details, but it's set in 1937. The Nazis have occupied it. So we had to also kind of make sure that all the other details in the environment are correct. But that's easy to do. But then we also have to think about, so it's a real world context, real world historical context, but then we have fictional elements that are also in the environment because it's an Indiana Jones story. So he's going through a real place, but then he's looking for fictional things that feed the narrative of the game. And so that, for example, is where I brought on the Egyptologist onto the game to help make sure that everything you see, even the fictional elements, like let's say he opens a fictional tomb and he goes inside and he sees a wall with fictional hieroglyphs up on the wall. Well, even the fictional hieroglyphs were done by Egyptologists who translated from English to hieroglyphic or to hieratic script, depending on what we needed in the game environment, to make sure that everything that you actually see in the game environment is exactly accurate, because we all know what players are going to do, whether it's hieroglyphs or another earthbound language. They will screenshot it and they will try and figure out exactly what it says, because that's what players do. And we wanted to make sure that everything that's there is accurate. But in order to do that, we have to make sure we know exactly the context. Like even in the case of the Giza Plateau, when they said, well, we have a tomb and Indy's going to get inside and he's going to find a wall and and the wall needs to say this certain thing in hieroglyphs. But then we have to ask, well, how old is the tomb supposed to be in Giza? I mean, is it like the Middle Kingdom? Is it the Old Kingdom? I mean, what era of ancient Egypt did it take place? Because that will change the translation of the hieroglyphs as well as the design of the tomb with the visual elements that we put inside the tomb. So even when you're working with something that is seemingly as simple as the real world, where we have real cues to use, it's not easy. There's a lot of questions you have to ask of the team. And then, of course, if you're making a fictional world like sci-fi or fantasy, Some people will say, well, that's a lot easier because you can just make up stuff. But I would argue you can't, not easily, because almost every single thing that game developers make, and true of any creative art form, not just games, it is a combination of real world inspiration as well as your own imagination. I mean, most art is usually taken from some real world inspiration, even a little bit. And oftentimes in games and storytelling, we use allegories, very strong allegories for a culture, for even fictional languages we create in games, like we did in the game Jade Empire. We created a language called Tho Fan, which was made to sound Asian, but because we did that because we did not want to actually use Chinese or other languages. So and so that concept of allegory, along with context, is extremely important. It's what I call allegorical distance. It's the concept I use, where basically, as creators, we have to encourage them. It's fine to take something from the real world as the start of the creative process, but as an allegory. But then they need to do the creative work to create enough allegorical distance to make sure that what you implement in the game is sufficiently different from the real world culture, unless your goal is to replicate that culture, which is different.
That is amazing. That is such an exciting process. It sounds so multi-layered. One question that came to mind is when we are working, when we're drawing inspiration from real world cultures, how do you see being subtle, like how to avoid flattening cultures in the stereotypes when we're drawing inspiration from them?
Well, that is the challenge. I mean, it's very difficult sometimes because any culture has elements that are pretty well known outside of it. Like most of my heritage is Scottish. So if I say I'm Scottish, what are people thinking? They're thinking kilts, bagpipes, haggis, the Loch Ness monster, very thick, interesting accent, all of that kind of stuff. Now, those are undeniably parts of Scotland. They're also stereotypes of Scotland. But if you go to Scotland, yes, you'll see kilts. Yes, you'll hear bagpipes. No, you won't see the Loch Ness monster, et cetera, only if you're lucky. But those are elements of the culture, but that's not what makes the culture what it is. I mean, not every single person wears a kilt. Not every single person plays the bagpipes. I know many Scots who hate haggis. They don't like it. So we can't just use that as a way to trigger and say, well, look, that's Scottish. So it's subtlety. It's the idea of subtlety. It's like there can be elements of that to represent, like the accent. Obviously, the accent is such a strong indicator, at least for a real world character, of where they are from. But even then, you have to be very careful. Like, I know the Indiana Jones game got praise from people in Egypt because the accent you hear of the NPCs walking around the Giza Plateau is actual Egyptian Arabic. It's not just like generic. And we did that on purpose. We wanted to make sure it was that accurate. But you have to be very, very careful about doing that replication, which also leads to the idea of cultural appropriation. But that's honestly another topic. But so when you want to replicate a culture, obviously you use those key elements, but you have to think about, like, what's your goal in using that culture in the first place? Why are they even in the game? Why does it make sense? And then one of the things, the techniques like some of the larger games have done, because they can actually afford it. Like Ubisoft does this strategy. They actually send some of the members of their team to the location that will be represented in the game. They did this, for example, with Far Cry 5 in Montana, where they sent the team to Montana to understand, what does it feel like to be here? What are the people like? And that is a very powerful way to help the team understand how to basically design the characters accurately without going too far towards tropes or stereotypes. But again, not a lot of companies can afford to do that with their team.
Yeah, but that seems a really, really powerful move in the best, the most straightforward way to immerse in the culture with all its cues and subtleties that you can only get by being physically present in the context of it. Yeah. I would also ask you, circling back to the fictional worlds that are mostly driven not only not that are not fully reflecting a certain culture. Have you seen in those fictional worlds cases when something seemingly neutral was harmful or sensitive to members of a particular market, even if
Absolutely. That happens a lot. Like if they have like a character in a fictional world use a certain kind of gesture,
yeah.
even gestures. I've worked on dancing games where we're looking for the gestures on body language to make sure it's not going to be a problem in certain markets. But even in a fictional world, sometimes they'll use that because they feel that most humans will understand the intention, even if it's like an alien character and the alien like gives a thumbs up to mean, yeah, everything's okay. Well, as we know, even in our world, the thumbs up does not universally mean okay. In some countries, it's the middle finger. And it's so we have to be extremely careful about assuming that even one gesture that we think most people understand, that doesn't mean it's going to be universally applied. And so we have to be super careful about that assumption. But I understand why a lot of creators do it, because it's easy. It's an easy thing to do. And they think like, well, we don't really have to think about what kind of gesture would that particular race of beings use in that universe. For example, when I worked on the game Cameo years ago, it's a completely fictional universe, and yet they had a grave marker that was a wooden cross on the side of the road. And I had to confront the artist about it. And I said, why is there a wooden cross here? And they said, well, they said I needed to make a grave marker. I'm like, well, a wooden cross, there is no Christianity in that universe. So why would they use a crucifix? Not to mention the fact that even in our world, a cross is not a universal grave marker. It's only a grave marker in more Christian dominant countries. So, we have to kind of think beyond that. Sometimes, to be quite honest, it's a bit of lazy creativity. But that's when we need to work a little bit harder. So like in the world of Cameo, so what would a grave marker look like? And that requires a different line of thought and creativity. We have to think about, well, what is the culture like here? What kind of thing, how do they bury their dead? Maybe that's not even important for the overall narrative, but in order to create the marker that's required by the side of the road, now you actually have to think through, what does it mean for the culture in the game to bury its dead? Do they even leave a marker? Do they have a ceremony? And so it's kind of the layers and layers of culture that you almost unintentionally create just by requiring one particular object to be in the environment. So like you said, it's very multi-layered. You really have to think deeply about all the impacts of even adding something as simple as one content asset or adding a symbol on a uniform or something. What does that symbol mean to the character? What does it mean in the world itself?
Yeah, that's once again proves how important it is for culturalization to be involved early in the process, because these are such subtleties that are not visible to the untrained eye. If we circle back to the localization, how it can catch those nuances later in the process, in case a team hasn't involved a culturalization strategist early in the process. Nadia, how would you say it is preventable? Is it preventable through context, like when the team has in its disposal screenshots, glossaries, string comments, so they can see the whole context of the game and see how something may be inappropriate in culture, and then provide guidance or review. So ultimately, how important is this kind of context in the localization process as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm not even saying about some basic words like open, where you can translate as a verb or noun, like adjective, because like there are different complexity behind, like where you can, for example, for tennis play, like serve can just have a completely different meaning, and all these cases they are not impossible to catch without the context. So as much context as you can have provided to the strings, so it's really important to have them. And I think also this is about actually a great role of the PM as an orchestrator in that process, because you can have a complete mass of different contexts, different style guides, but you need to be you need to also to watch it as a player, to have this experience and estimate what it'd be like to translate your localization team these parts of these elements of UI. And also it's not only about this is also what Kate was referring to when she was saying that this is also about the feedback from the community, because especially it's important with games where with these studios which have billions of installs worldwide, and they have a very strong voice of the community, and you need to make sure that their feedback is passed to the translation team, as well as translation team feedbacks also passed to the developers. So also this is about all these feedbacks crossing both ways to the team and from the team, and making sure that this is properly applied across all the locales. So yeah, this is definitely about the context, but also about the PMs as a moderator in that situation, making sure that this is just relevant in all targets. And and definitely we can ignore such as LQT, just making sure, verifying that eventually everything lands properly in the game.
It seems that localization project manager prevents the process from becoming chaotic, because it is really complex, and a lot of different processes are involved. As we were discussing, I was listening to both of your perspective. I also thought about how much attention should be driven towards adaptation, but also how does the process of balancing adaptation with preservation work in culturalization and localization. So, Kate, from your perspective, when you were designing those very regional specific launches that were only relevant to a specific market, have you encountered this challenge of balancing global brand with local relevance, and how did you approach this?
Yeah, I mean that's always a challenge. I mean that depends, of course, on what IP you're working with. I mean, some IPs are undeniably global. I mean, everyone knows what they are. So then it's a matter of whether or not they're really going to be applicable to a specific market. I mean, some of the games I've worked on, like some of the first-person shooters like Call of Duty and Battlefield, I mean, that they have players all over the world. But, we also know that not everyone in different markets likes different kinds of genres. Like Japan's a great example. They're not as big on first-person shooters. I remember years ago being in Tokyo in Akihabara on the day of the Halo 3 launch, back when I worked on those games, and there was not a single person in line anywhere because nobody cared. Whereas back in the US, there were lines that were kilometers long for people waiting to get their copy at midnight, because it's a very big deal there. Of course, then in Japan, if you go to the Pokemon Center wait and see the lines for the new Pokemon game release, it's the same thing. The lines are crazy long. So, that kind of different regional and or market difference is something that we have to keep in mind. And it depends again on the IP. It depends on the type of genre of the game it is. But certainly there are players everywhere who will enjoy a certain kind of game. So it's one of those things where when you're making the decision, how much culturalization should we do for a particular game? For me, I mean, the baseline that I tell anyone I work with, it's my goal is to maximize the global reach of your game. Now you have to decide, where do you draw the line in your creative vision and in your creative work on the amount of changes you want to do to the core creative game. Because some markets like China, for example, may require a lot more changes than you're willing to do, whereas some other markets like maybe the MENA region or some other locales, it might require changing a few little things, but not to excess. And of course, we also have to constantly be keeping an eye on market changes. That's part of the key part of my job, is that when I'm working on a project, I'm looking just over the horizon to see what is the market going to be like potentially in 2 to 3 years. Like that was the case for Battlefield 6 that I did a lot of work on for over 3 years. And with having real world locations of the game like Tajikistan, Gibraltar, Brooklyn, real world places. I mean, I'm looking at seeing what's going on in Tajikistan. Are there any geopolitical events that are going to make it more sensitive to have the game set there? Or, obviously bringing a war to Brooklyn. 9/11 was, 25 years ago, but it's still very fresh, especially for people who live in New York City. So what is the sensitivity going to be and the perception going to be of doing that scenario in the game, in that location? So we have to think through all of those things while we're keeping an eye on the conditions in the real world and how that might impact our games. And so it does make it very, very complicated. And it also informs us on whether or not we do think it's a good idea to make a specific change for a specific reason. I will say, just to wrap up my comment, is that more and more games, especially in mobile, because the mobile development process tends to be far more agile than doing like a massive AAA game on console or PC, which takes years to put together. So I've seen more in the mobile space, because their dev cycles are more agile and basically smaller dev cycles. They are doing more considerations around doing this proactive culturalization, where they're looking at like some of their analytics, saying, where are we seeing players increase? Why are we getting more players in that market? And then maybe we should do something special for them, for that specific market, to basically help it grow even faster. And especially in markets and regions where they want to see a lot more growth for their company, based on the genre of game that they make and the IP. So there's all those different levers that you're constantly looking at to kind of move, to kind of see how can we maximize the enjoyment and the impact of our game title in that location.
Thank you. So you also mentioned a very important point about how it's also necessary to try and to predict how the market is going to progress over the next couple of years. What are the potential changes, risks, and how do you keep an eye on these nuances and subtleties? How do you keep your finger on the pulse of everything that's going on in the world to navigate this geopolitical complexity?
Well, that's technically, I consider that to be part of my job. But honestly, I would say 15 to 20% of the work I do is not games at all. It's actually geopolitics, online cartography, helping Google, helping other digital mapping companies. And that requires me to keep an eye on exactly where every disputed area is in the world, every disputed boundary, every island, every place name, all of that kind of stuff. So actually, the non-games work that I do helps inform my games work as well. But I will say on top of that, though, is that one of the things I've been telling a lot of audiences these days when I give talks is that I actually have them recite the fact that someone is going to hate their game, whether they like it or not. And they have to just accept the fact, because that's the way the world is. That's the world we live in now, that we know that communities will react negatively to anything for any reason. And so we're not trying to reduce hate of a game, because you can't. It's impossible. What you're trying to do is mitigate whether it's 30 people who are yelling at you or 30,000 people yelling at you. Because if it's the latter, then you probably did something wrong. But if it's 30 people, then it's just another Monday.
It also ties back to the importance of working with communities that Nadia, you I think mentioned about how not only the incoming information but also the community information is important. Have you seen this post hate work happening in the localization? So maybe like you rolled out the localized version and a client saw the negative reviews and then came back to you to work through this issue.
Yeah, I had like a case when just we had this feedback from the community that, it seems to us that this creature is evolving not that way, it's becoming too boring, not so funny, what's happening? So yeah, and like this is the point where we have had to sit and say, okay, now we need all possible screencasts, all the mechanics, how this character acts, performs, and interacts with other characters. So so normally this is like a job of like preparing like all the materials and just also to doing different tasks, trying different linguists and trying to find the appropriate links for this particular task, because we understand like each translator has its own style, and probably this style is just is not matching in that case. So yeah.
So what is typically needed to best to translate, but also preserve the characters' wit, voice, humor, emotional lore? So you're saying it's the screencast, I guess the full localization kit. So if you were to wrap up, how can the client help to adapt the character without losing its identity, but also to do the localization work? What is needed from the client, and how do we on the localization vendor side do this full adaptation and preservation of the character's lore?
Yeah, it's like it's always the balance, because like you can adapt and change everything, like just and do like just this from scratch. It's not like a completely transcreation process, but still you also need to have this like freedom to do this adaptation, because like without it, these characters won't be relevant in the target audience, and you also need to understand that. So yeah, normally it starts also from the team of translators. Also, just this is like a crucial part when you need to be very like peculiar when trying to understand who fits this project really, and this is also like what like a PM as an orchestrator does, like trying to understand what would be a good match for this particular project. So yeah, and definitely all these assets are, and as much descriptions as possible, and as much as it is understanding. Sometimes we also have like live sessions with our clients where they just do some parts of their UI and screencasting it to them, to us, to the team of translators. And it's also important in order to like have this direct feedback from the studio, understanding like what's really should be done in that case. So like it's a collaboration, definitely.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point about an ongoing collaboration and orchestrating the whole process. As much as there are a lot of topics to cover within culturalization and localization, as we're coming closer to the end, I would like to ask like one broad closing question is what are the most common things that teams underestimate when they're thinking about localization and culturalization? From both of your experience, so Kate, from the culturalization side, what do you think is one thing or a couple of things that are most often underestimated in the process that you wish to raise awareness about?
Oh, there's so many things, but let me. I would say that the number one thing that we've kind of already touched upon is with culturalization, you have to start early. You have to start at the beginning. You can't just treat it like another thing you get to later, because honestly, it's like if you really want to be effective at doing this work, you have to start at the earliest possible point. It saves a lot of money. It saves a lot of frustration, a lot of panic that often happens, because that's often one of the things I've seen when it happens later is that people get into this panic mode. And one of the dangers, especially with culturalization, is that they knee-jerk panic. And let's say, for example, they're hearing something from their community and they say, we're going to we'll fix it to make those folks happy. Well, if you do that, let's say, for example, it's in the Korean market, they fix it for Korea. Well, guess what? Now you've made Japan and China very angry, because the team didn't understand the very complicated cultural, historical sensitivities between those three countries. So not being aware of that kind of dynamic, it can be very dangerous. So I would say it has to be early. And honestly, it's more complicated than they think. It's not just about cultural appropriation. It's not just about don't use this gesture or something. I mean, that's where it starts. But oftentimes those conversations lead, as they have many times in my work, to a much bigger conversation about what are our values as creators. What values does our company have? What do we want to be known for in terms of the kind of content that we produce? And that's a much bigger conversation that, again, you want to have time for.
That is amazing how culturalization also taps so much into branding and defining the mission and values of the company. These are very important conversations to have, and I'm really glad to see how you raise awareness about this area, because as we mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, it is unfortunately this term is not yet as popular as the many other terms like localization, internationalization, globalization. So I hope to see more and more teams integrating as early in the process as possible. All right, and Nadia, from the localization production side, what would you say is the key thing that you wish was more wasn't so underestimated, and yeah, that game teams would pay attention to?
Yeah, I would say that it's also like one thing that really is not is just like a drop off is when like teams before starting localizing any and targeting any market, they are not completely not thinking about if they're able to support that market, because you can. This is like this first impression that you can do, and then not without being able to support it to have these tickets covered and having any QAs and other different materials are provided to gamers, then like it's a broken again experience, and you should also consider that. And unfortunately, not so many companies do that. They just avoid it, and like this is really like a thing to consider.
Thank you so much. And thank you both. It was a really valuable conversation, and it unveiled so many layers that I think it requires another couple of hours to go into all of them. Both fields are very, very multi-layers, but I'm so glad we covered the foundational elements of both. And I think my main key takeaway is that both are very strategic directions, and they should be involved early. Thank you everyone who joined us. Please feel free to continue the discussion in the comments or reach out to our amazing speakers, and we'll be happy to hear all your questions and thoughts. Thank you, Kate and Nadia, also for contributing your insights and for this very valuable conversation.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.